Okay, depth we have talked about, but I want to show you something a little bit different today. So we know that depth in, let's say, a clay brush, depth helps us determine the amount of the effect. But we just saw with the blob brush that raising that depth doesn't necessarily raise the effect, right? It doesn't always work that way. Let's go in the negative direction. And now it's not behaving the right way. And that's because conceiving of depth as elevation is not the right way. It looks like this is elevation, but it is doing pretty much exactly what this shows. It's taking the entire brush, the sphere of influence for that brush, it's taking the center of it and raising that above the surface or below the surface. So that means that, for example, in the clay brush, in just a normal surface, the clay brush, let's do it this way. The clay brush is designed so that wherever that point is, wherever the center of that brush is, its job is to pull form within its reach up to it. So it's going to pull everything up to the center of that brush, or the center of its effect. If clay buildup is on, then it'll just keep building this up. So the clay brush, for the clay brush, depth acts as elevation because that's the behavior of the brush. Because the behavior of the brush is to pull forms up. Okay, but that's not the case with the blob brush. The function of the blob brush is different, and so when you change the effect, it's not going to have the same result. In fact, it appears like the blob brush is designed to have an impact. Oh, it looks like my keys got reversed. One second. Nice. So it appears that the blob brush's effect getting lowered into the surface is just causing it to not, it's missing some things, it's not establishing the proper chatter. Give me just 2 seconds here. All right, I'm back. Okay, now this is everything I just explained is a little confusing, but thankfully I've got an ace in the hole. I've got one brush that really helps explain it. So I'm going to go into Lightbox. I'm going to go into Brush. I'm going to come over to Miscellaneous and the spherical brush. I love this brush. The base type is standard, but look at its embed. This is really great for creating spherical surfaces. Now the algorithm changed a little bit in the versions, or not the algorithm, but some of the features around it. So from my view, it used to work a lot better, but now it's still pretty good. Anyways, it's a lot like Magnify, right? Doing its best. But you can kind of see, in fact, let me see if I can really do this. I'm going to try to keep these at the same point. Okay. So you see the brush, the two spheres. We'll take a look at what focal shift is. but it's really getting that inside of the brush. What's really happening though is that this entire sphere of influence is being pushed down into the model, so that quite literally this sphere that we see here is actually buried deep down like that, and we only see this cross section of its effect. We only see everything above. Who is still with me? Tell me if you're understanding that, or if you can explain that to everybody else. Let me see if I need to change my tack on how I explained it. Great. So it's just pulling that sphere of influence inside of the model. As soon as I set that back up at 0, it's just a standard brush. But if that's the brush, taking it to embed of -74, just push that form in. Real straightforward. But I mention that because a lot of times people get confused between depth equals elevation, modifier equals elevation, because they say that. And you can see it with the clay brush, the higher elevation. Higher this thing goes. And then draw size is really important to this as well. Okay, so some people are with me. Some people are not with me. Ask me questions. Do whatever you need so we can get clear on that. And then let's move on and start talking about some of these settings in samples. And you have the entire class to ask me questions. So who remembers what build-up does? Michael's got it. It just keeps sampling. If you hover control, then it'll tell you. But basically, it just means that as your stroke moves along, it continually resamples so that it'll push the elevation up. And this is literally the only significant difference between clay tubes and clay buildup. That's the only difference, is that setting. All right, now let's just talk in general terms about this. Fast samples. This is equivalent to how in the stroke you had dots and you had the freehand stroke. Fast samples is a newer algorithm. Not a newer algorithm. It's a newer way of calculating the sample. But they didn't want to get rid of the old way because the old way works with some of the other brushes. Doesn't matter which brushes. You just need to remember that it works with older brushes, so they have to keep it in. That's one of the reasons why a lot of these, they just add features, basically, is because the old brushes, and there's still old parts of the matrix there. So you don't reinvent, redevelop the whole thing. You just add a feature, makes life easier. You will almost never use constant samples or on surface. The change in form is usually very minimal. The most significant thing to know about it is sample radius.